server when some event happens, right? So we'll see the syntax for how to write, how to create a trigger, right? So similar to procedures or functions, we have some syntax for creating a trigger, right? So the syntax is like create trigger, trigger name, right? So the trigger can be created before any DML statement, before or after or instead of, right? So create or replace, right? Generally we start with create trigger. So each and every trigger has its unique name, create trigger, trigger name, and before or after or instead of, we have some DML operations like insert. So you can create a trigger before some insert operation or after insert operation, or like update or delete of column name on table name, referencing old as O and new as N, right? So whenever you want to refer to the old variable or attribute, we refer to as old as O and new as N for each row. So when condition, right? So we have declaration statements, you have executable statements and exceptional handling statements, right? So this is the format for creating a trigger, right? So create trigger, trigger name. Trigger can be created before, after, or instead of keyword. It can be created before a insert operation or before any DML operation or after DML operation. So the instead of keyword is you work with the views of on record, right? So you have again when condition. So declare, you have some declarative declaration statements, executable statements within the begin block, and exception handling statements end, right? So let us explore more about the syntax. So create or create trigger, trigger name. So it create or replaces an existing trigger with trigger name, and this keywords before, after, instead of, right? So they specify when the trigger has to be executed, right? As I said that the instead of clause is used for creating an trigger on views or virtual tables. We go for this instead of class. Else triggers can be created or before or after an DML statement, right? So insert or delete or update. So this specifies the DML operation of column name, right? So it specifies the column name that would be updated. On table name, it specifies the name of the table associated with the trigger, right? So right, so we are exploring more about this. So create trigger, trigger name. So any trigger is associated with the trigger, create or replace a trigger, trigger name. Then like it can be created before or after an DML statement, and instead of clause is used while working with virtual tables or views of column name. It denotes the attribute on table name, right? So it specifies the table name associated with the trigger, right? So whenever you are going to refer to the old variables, we'll be referencing old as O and new as N, right? So this allows you to refer to old values for various DML statements like insert, update, and delete, right? And for each row means it specifies the row level trigger. So the trigger would be executed for each row being affected, right? Otherwise, it will be executed only once, right? So whenever you write a trigger, you need to specify for each row. And when condition, so this provides the condition for rows for which a trigger should fire, right? So let me like a database administrator can grant some trigger, creating trigger rights to some user, right? So grant create trigger to Alex, right? Alex can create and execute some triggers, right? Let us see this simple example first, and then we'll move on to other examples. So for example, you have a person's table, create table person. It contains ID, person ID, name, date of birth, and the primary key is going to be the person ID, right? So for example, uh, right, I think this is associated with this trigger is associated with this table. Like you have only two attributes, number and name, right? So you have number one corresponds to A, two corresponds to name B, and so on. So you are going to create a trigger before insert on the table student, right? So when before you insert a record on the student table, you are expected to delete a record where the number is equal to 1 using triggers, right? So this is how we are going to create a trigger. So create or replace a trigger dd. So trigger name is dd, right? For each row, begin you are going to delete from student where number is equal to 1, right? So once you have created a trigger, so trigger is automatic, it's a stored procedure. It is automatically executed whenever some event happens, right? So here, which event should happen? Whenever you are going to insert some record onto student table, automatically the first record gets deleted, right? So initially you have 4 records starting from 1 to 4. Now let us try to insert a new record with name E and number 5. So once the first one row is inserted into the student table, right? So automatically the first record or student with number 1 gets deleted, right? So this is like this is how we can use triggers to work with tables, right? Let me show you some other example, and I will show you, right? Right. So for example, you want to uh, raise an exception using trigger, right? So for example, in trigger, exception is an error, or exception in trigger is one that stops the code from updating the database. So for example, you have a person database, you need to restrict anyone from updating the end user from updating the date of birth attribute of a particular of all the employees in person's database, right? So this is going to be the code. So create or replace a trigger person underscore date of birth, right? So the trigger name is create trigger person underscore date of birth. So before update of date of birth on person, for each row, you are going to raise an application error, raise underscore application error minus 20,000 cannot change date of birth, right? So this trigger will be automatically triggered whenever some user tries to update the date of birth attribute of any record in person table, right? So let us see an example, right? So for example, let us update the table person, set date of birth equal to system date. So automatically it will say that uh, an error occurs and the user is not will not be able to change the date of birth and so on, right? uh, so let me share you some other information of how to work with triggers. Let me share you how to some few examples of working with triggers in MySQL.